Why did a powerful American general suddenly reverse course, going from publicly criticizing to praising a young African military leader? What happened behind the scenes that left the world stunned by this unexpected shift? It wasn't a coup, a classified leak, or a battlefield defeat. It was just a sentence. One sentence that woke up a continent, forced a general to backpedal, and made Washington reconsider its long-standing diplomatic posture in Africa. Today's video dives into the symbolic power shift between Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, and General Michael Langley, the head of U.S. Africa Command. It all started when Langley accused Traoré of using national gold reserves to strengthen military control rather than serve his people. But what Langley did not anticipate was the fierce backlash, not just from Burkina Faso, but from Mali, Guinea, and Niger as well. Outrage spread rapidly on social media, in the streets, and even in diplomatic backchannels. Why did a single statement spark such a firestorm? Because it touched a historical nerve, the legacy of exploitation, condescension, and imposed control. It struck a chord with a new generation of Africans who refuse to remain silent when their dignity is challenged. And this forced an American general, trained to lead on the battlefield, to retreat on the front lines of public opinion. But the story doesn't end there. What surprised many even more was what happened next under pressure from both abroad and within Washington. General Langley didn't just walk back his statement, he began to praise Traoré. There were no new elections, no major policy shifts from Burkina Faso. It was simply America changing its tone. So what compelled this about-face? Did Langley truly change his view, or was it a calculated diplomatic move? We'll explore that in the next part of the video. Because this isn't just a story about two men, it's a sign of something much bigger. Africa is no longer willing to play the role of the lectured. The continent is entering a new era, one in which it demands respect, or it walks away entirely from those who don't listen. The story didn't begin with a military coup or an economic crisis. It began with a sentence uttered in a calm and confident tone at a U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. General Michael Langley, head of U.S. Africa Command, accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré of using Burkina Faso's national gold reserves to entrench military control rather than uplift the people. No evidence was provided, no context, no reference to Burkina Faso's own position or reasoning. That statement was quickly interpreted not as policy analysis, but as a political attack, and it struck a deeper nerve. To many Africans, it echoed the old tone of colonial condescension, where Western powers lecture and scold African leaders as if they were misbehaving subordinates. Langley's accusation, veiled in diplomatic language, was received as an insult, a modern-day slap from a distant empire. The backlash didn't start with governments, it exploded online. Within hours, Langley's words were translated into French, Swahili, Arabic, and dozens of local dialects. Independent journalists, social media influencers, and activists dissected the sentence with surgical precision. Basic questions emerged. Who really has the right to decide how Burkina Faso's gold is used? Isn't nationalization a sovereign right? And since when did a foreign general sitting thousands of miles away hold moral authority over an independent African nation? Soon, African media picked up the story, and they weren't on Langley's side. From Mali to Ghana to the Democratic Republic of Congo, headlines painted his words as an example of neo-colonial arrogance cloaked in polite rhetoric. The fact that Langley made the statement in a supposedly routine Senate hearing didn't help, it only underscored how casually Western power dismissed African autonomy. In Burkina Faso, Traoré said nothing, and that silence was powerful. He didn't need to defend himself. The public had done it for him. His restraint signaled strength, awareness, and strategic patience, letting the tide of public opinion build organically. Langley's brief statement had inadvertently triggered a much larger debate, one about sovereignty, dignity, and the terms of respect in global diplomacy. Instead of weakening Traoré, the U.S. general had inadvertently turned him into a new icon of post-colonial African assertiveness. As General Langley's remarks spread across Africa, what followed wasn't just a backlash, it was a media earthquake. Hashtags like respect African sovereignty and our hands off our gold trended widely. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, hundreds of youth took to the streets carrying banners, one reading, "Langley, who owns Africa." Each image, post, and tweet radiated anger, not just toward one man, but toward a system that had overstayed its welcome. What made this more remarkable was that the outrage didn't stay within Burkina Faso's borders. In Bamako, Niamey, even Lagos youth forums, student groups, and civil society organizations hosted discussions and workshops on resource sovereignty and the right to respect. Langley became a symbol of how the West still views Africa through an outdated lens, and younger generations roundly rejected it. Artists also joined the response. Murals appeared depicting Captain Traoré trampling puppets draped in Western flags. Rappers and musicians released protest songs condemning neo-colonialism. On YouTube, videos analyzing Langley's comments racked up hundreds of thousands of views, mostly from young viewers hungry for truth and national pride. Even those who had previously criticized Traoré's militarized leadership found themselves siding with him. They hadn't changed their politics, but they shared one core value: dignity. For them, a U.S. general sitting in Washington, passing judgment on Burkina Faso's government, was unacceptable, regardless of internal disagreements. The controversy produced a rare moment of unity, where political rivals paused their disputes to confront external disrespect together. International analysts took note of the phenomenon. A single sentence had sparked political consciousness and cross-border solidarity across Africa. Internal polls showed a marked rise in support for Traoré, especially among young people. This wasn't just an emotional response, it was a sign that Africans were beginning to see themselves as central actors in shaping their nation's path. In the age of modern media, a misstep can be exposed in hours, and Langley's case proved it. But more importantly, it was the scale, creativity, and depth of Africa's public reaction that reshaped the narrative. Africans were no longer passive listeners, they were active critics, responders, and counter-narrators, using thought, art, and community power. As the wave of African backlash grew, what worried Washington most wasn't the protests or hashtags, it was the silence. Silence from allied governments. Silence from regional security partners in the Sahel. In diplomatic circles, such silence isn't indifference, it's a signal. When calls go unanswered, invitations ignored, and joint meetings suddenly postponed, it isn't coincidence, it's warning. Across U.S. embassies in Africa, diplomats began filing reports describing an alarming diplomatic chill. Intelligence sharing slowed. Military coordination, the backbone of America's influence strategy, became uncertain. Some African defense ministers even threatened to withdraw from scheduled summits unless Langley publicly apologized. Inside the Pentagon, pressure mounted. National security advisors feared not just diplomatic fallout, but the power vacuum forming. As the U.S. scrambled to manage the crisis, China and Russia quietly advanced. Beijing offered new infrastructure deals without commenting on Langley's remarks. Moscow expanded military cooperation, dispatching advisors, and launching special forces training programs across West Africa. Turkey and Iran began new cultural and technological dialogues with Sahel governments. Even countries like Indonesia joined in. The threat for Washington wasn't merely the embarrassment of one general, it was the risk of losing control. In the past, the U.S. could pressure governments through aid cuts or diplomatic admonitions. Now those tools were ineffective, worse, they backfired. Soft power was fraying, and hard power was ill-suited to an environment surging with popular pride and political self-determination. Langley's inner circle grew uneasy. Experts in African affairs warned he had misread the moment. Traoré wasn't just an isolated strongman, He was the face of a broader movement, young military-trained leaders, popular with youth for championing sovereignty and economic control. To attack him was to challenge a continental current. In modern diplomacy, where every statement echoes in real time, verbal missteps can become strategic fractures. Washington wrongly assumed the issue could be managed internally. But Africa today is no longer quietly watching. It is responding, organizing, and using every opportunity to redraw the balance of influence. While the U.S. scrambled to explain, Africa was already rewriting the map. Following a wave of intense backlash from African public opinion and clear diplomatic frost from strategic partners in the Sahel, General Michael Langley, the head of U.S. Africa Command, unexpectedly changed his tone. From a controversial accusation that interim President Ibrahim Traoré was exploiting national gold to consolidate power, Langley shifted to praising the same leader as a visionary strategist. This sudden reversal raised a critical question for international analysts. Was this a sincere reassessment? Initially, Langley's remarks were perceived as part of Washington's broader strategy to maintain influence in Africa by warning against undemocratic models and halting the continent's drift from Western alignment. But what the Pentagon did not foresee was the domino effect of those words, a wave of outrage that swept through social media, academic forums, news outlets, and among the rising generation of African leadership. Langley wasn't just criticized as arrogant, he was seen as reigniting a colonial reflex that stuck. In this context, Langley's praise, issued weeks later, was far from personal. It was clearly a strategic maneuver, a damage control attempt to reverse public sentiment and rescue frozen diplomatic channels. In reality, his initial criticism had not only damaged his reputation, but also put U.S. strategic influence in West Africa at serious risk. What's more telling is that during the entire media crisis, President Traoré never changed course. He neither publicly condemned nor softened toward the United States. Instead, Burkina Faso's government pressed forward with nationalizing resources, strengthening ties with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and promoting economic self-reliance. This made one thing clear: the shift came not from Traoré, but from Langley. Many political observers argue that Langley's change of tone is a sign of passive diplomacy, when a superpower no longer shapes the game, but must adjust to stay in it. In this case, Langley's compliments weren't an admission of fault. They were an attempt to keep a dialogue channel from drifting away. The deeper issue, however, lies in credibility. When someone who previously made sharp accusations suddenly turns to flattery, without any accompanying policy shift, the compliment is seen as hollow. And that's exactly how many young Africans interpreted Langley's praise, as a tactical move, not an act of goodwill. Burkina Faso's government didn't respond with fanfare. It remained silent, a new kind of soft power, signaling that external validation was unnecessary. Through consistent policy and growing support from regional allies, Burkina Faso demonstrated that an African nation can command respect without needing Western endorsement. Langley didn't lose his post, but his reversal became a symbolic marker of shifting global power. In the past, a U.S. general's words could reshape narratives. Today, one ill-judged comment can force a retreat of an entire diplomatic approach. More profoundly, the Langley-Traoré episode illustrates a new world order in formation, one where global South nations are no longer just recipients of aid, but drivers of negotiation terms. If the West, led by the U.S., fails to accept this, it will keep finding itself in defensive positions, forced to praise those it once condemned, not out of changed values, but out of necessity. In the world of geopolitics, silence often speaks louder than words, and apologies, especially those given in public by powerful figures, are rarely as simple as they appear. The saga of General Michael Langley and President Ibrahim Traoré is more than a moment of tension. It is a milestone in the evolving balance of global power. It reveals not only the fragility of traditional Western diplomacy in Africa, but also the bold rise of new sovereign narratives that are reshaping the continent's role on the world. At first glance, Langley's reversal seems to be about a general adjusting his tone. But look closer, and it becomes clear that what truly shifted wasn't just his rhetoric, it was the entire framework of Western engagement with Africa. For decades, African countries were expected to adapt, conform, and comply. Today, they are asserting, defining, and leading. Langley's about-face in this context is not merely a diplomatic course correction. It is an acknowledgement, whether intentional or not, that the old Traoré's rise is emblematic of a larger pattern. Across the Sahel and beyond, a new generation of African leaders is emerging, not molded by Western institutions, but forged by national struggles, military discipline, and a firm belief in self-determination. These leaders speak a different diplomatic language, one rooted in sovereignty, economic independence, and unapologetic pragmatism. They are not rebels without cause. They are statesmen of a new era, backed by populations that are increasingly informed. For too long, the global narrative has depicted Africa as a continent to be managed, advised, and guided. Aid came with lectures. Military support came with oversight. Partnerships came with conditionalities. But the reaction to Langley's initial remarks and the consequences that followed proved something different, that Africa no longer flinches when accused, and it certainly doesn't beg when criticized. Instead, it recalibrates, organizes, and pushes forward with more clarity. The United States in particular finds itself at a crossroads. Its traditional levers of influence, military bases, development assistance, and institutional partnerships no longer command the same loyalty or gratitude. In an increasingly multipolar world, the tools that once guaranteed access now provoke skepticism. While China builds infrastructure without interference, and Russia offers military assistance without judgment, the West still struggles to let go of its paternalistic playbook. This is not to say that Western values or models have no place in Africa. Democracy, human rights, and transparency remain important pillars, but they must be offered, not imposed, shared, not demanded. Respect is no longer a diplomatic courtesy, it is a prerequisite. And in this regard, Langley's stumble was more than a personal misstep. It was a case study in what happens when power is exercised without awareness of changing political climates. What makes Traoré's handling of the entire episode even more significant is his strategic silence. He didn't gloat. He didn't retaliate. He let the backlash unfold organically. In doing so, he demonstrated not just media savvy, but a deep understanding of regional sentiment. His quiet strength amplified his legitimacy, not just in Burkina Faso, but across neighboring states watching closely. This silence, this refusal to be reactive, sent a powerful message. African dignity is not contingent on external validation. It is self-generated, rooted in history, culture, and an emerging geopolitical consciousness. And as more African nations follow this trajectory, the continent is no longer asking to be seen. It is demanding to be respected. Langley's pivot, when viewed from this lens, becomes symbolic. It represents the moment when the U.S. had to recalibrate not just its message, but its entire method. No longer could it rely on authority alone. It had to learn to listen, to adjust, and to re-enter African discourse not as a patron but as a partner. Yet the story is far from over. The deeper implications of this episode will unfold over years, not weeks. Will the West adapt meaningfully, or will it merely soften its tone while keeping the same structures intact? Will new African leadership models continue to gain ground, or will they face resistance from within and without? These are questions that go beyond any one general or president. They touch on the future of diplomacy itself. In a global landscape increasingly shaped by multipolarity, soft power will depend not on the volume of a country's voice, but on the integrity of its actions. Words will be measured not by their eloquence, but by their alignment with respect, recognition, and relevance. Traoré's steadfastness and Langley's recalibration may seem like isolated events, but they are part of a broader narrative, one in which Africa is no longer the background, it is the protagonist. And the world is beginning to realize it. In this light, The final message of this story is not about winning or losing. It's about learning. The world must learn to treat Africa not as a proving ground for foreign ideals, but as a continent of equals with its own paths, its own models, and its own voice. To all viewers, thinkers, and leaders, this is not just a diplomatic anecdote. It's a historical inflection point. What happens next will depend on who chooses to listen, who chooses to evolve, and who chooses to lead with humility rather than hubris. Because in the end, true influence is not seized, it is earned, and respect once demanded is now being expected. Africa has changed. The question is, will the world? The story of General Michael Langley's abrupt reversal from publicly criticizing Captain Ibrahim Traoré to praising him as a visionary offers far more than a momentary media sensation. It stands as a vivid lesson in the changing dynamics of global power, the rise of African sovereignty, and the limits of traditional diplomacy in a world increasingly shaped by public consciousness and digital mobilization. At its core, the episode reveals the growing mismatch between outdated perceptions of African nations and the continent's new political reality. For decades, Western institutions operated under the assumption that influence in Africa could be maintained through a combination of military presence, development aid, and rhetorical leadership. Statements like Langley's accusing Burkina Faso's leader of using gold reserves for personal power might have passed without major consequence in previous eras. But in today's Africa, empowered by social media, regional solidarity, and a new generation of critical thinkers, such declarations are no longer met with silence. They are dissected, challenged, and rejected with forceful clarity. The backlash Langley faced wasn't orchestrated by governments or political elites. It was organic. It came from everyday citizens, students, artists, and community leaders who instantly recognized the deeper meaning behind his words. His criticism touched a raw nerve, reminding Africans of a long and painful history of condescension, control, and foreign lecturing. But unlike the past, this generation did not internalize the insult, they externalized their pride. They mobilized not in defense of a single leader, but in defense of their collective dignity. This demonstrates a profound shift in African identity from reactive to proactive, from fragmented to united across borders. One key lesson is the power of symbolic leadership. Traoré, by choosing not to respond, showed immense strategic restraint. In diplomacy, silence can often carry more weight than words. His refusal to engage in a rhetorical war allowed the public and broader regional opinion to fill the void. And what emerged was a groundswell of support that transcended politics. Even critics of his militarized governance stood by him not because they agreed with his policies, but because they refused to let external actors undermine national sovereignty. This kind of support reflects a deeper loyalty to principles rather than personalities. Langley's about-face rebranding Traoré as a visionary was a tactical move driven not by conviction but by necessity. It teaches us that in the realm of geopolitics, credibility is currency. When a powerful figure pivots dramatically without explanation, the gesture is perceived as hollow. In Langley's case, the praise came too late and too softly. It was interpreted not as respect but as damage control, and in doing so, it inadvertently highlighted the fragility of U.S. influence on the continent. The broader implication is this: Africa is no longer content to be a passive recipient of global policy. It demands agency, respect, and equal footing in diplomatic discourse. Countries like Burkina Faso are charting new paths, aligning with non-Western powers, asserting resource control, and fostering domestic pride. These are not the actions of rogue states. They are the hallmarks of emerging geopolitical self-determination, and the world must adapt or risk becoming irrelevant in African affairs. Moreover, the Langley-Traoré saga underscores the diminishing efficacy of traditional soft power tools. Public opinion now plays a decisive role in shaping international relations. Social media platforms serve as battlegrounds where narratives are built and dismantled in real time. A single sentence, poorly framed and poorly timed, can unravel years of strategic planning. This means that the art of diplomacy must evolve. It can no longer rely solely on classified cables and elite dialogues. It must resonate with the public, align with cultural values, and be grounded in mutual respect. Another vital lesson is that silence from African leaders should no longer be mistaken for passivity. In this case, Traoré's lack of verbal response was not indifference, but calculated strength. He allowed the storm to build around him, not through manipulation, but through confidence in his people's reaction. This is a powerful form of leadership, one that trusts the voice of the population and understands the symbolic weight of posture over rhetoric. Internationally, the repercussions were equally telling. Langley's remarks did not just affect Burkina Faso, they triggered a regional reaction. From Mali to Niger, Ghana to the Democratic Republic of Congo, young people debated issues of resource control, foreign interference, and the meaning of dignity. Artists created protest murals. Rappers released anti-colonial tracts. Youth groups hosted workshops. This cross-border solidarity was spontaneous, yet strategic, unified not by geography, but by shared historical wounds and contemporary aspirations. It also exposed vulnerabilities in the Western diplomatic playbook. For too long, the West approached Africa through a top-down lens, using policy tools to influence behavior while failing to understand local sentiment. But influence that doesn't respect dignity is not influence, it's coercion. And coercion in today's global context backfires. As the United States scrambled to recover diplomatic footing, countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran moved in swiftly, offering alternatives that, regardless of their motives, came without the burden of judgmental language. This is not to romanticize new alliances or vilify old ones. It is simply a recognition that Africa now has options, and with options come leverage. The continent is no longer trapped in a binary choice between dependency and isolation. It is actively redefining its partnerships based on mutual interest rather than imposed allegiance. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is the need for humility in global engagement. Langley's initial misstep stemmed from a failure to recognize that Africa is no longer the continent of the 20th century. Today, its people are connected, its youth are politically literate, and its leaders are increasingly rooted in nationalist legitimacy. Statements made in Washington now echo in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Kinshasa within minutes, and the reaction is swift, strategic, and often unified. As such, the episode should serve as a wake-up call for global powers. It is no longer enough to issue statements and expect compliance. Engagement must be mutual. Dialogue must be built on listening, not lecturing. Respect is no longer optional, it is the foundation of sustainable diplomacy. In conclusion, the Langley-Traoré incident is not a minor diplomatic hiccup. It is a chapter in the emerging story of African autonomy. It shows that narratives can be shifted, power can be challenged, and dignity can be defended not through war, but through words, silence, and the will of the people. The lesson for the world is clear: Africa has found its voice, and it will not be silenced. As an African citizen witnessing this diplomatic spectacle unfold, I must say this episode was not only eye-opening, it was empowering. For too long we have endured the West's condescending tone, disguised as concern and masked under the pretense of democracy and human rights. But the moment General Langley opened his mouth to question the intentions of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, something inside many of us snapped. It wasn't just an attack on one leader, it was a reminder of the system that treats our countries as perpetual students, never ready to graduate. What Langley did, whether intentional or not, reminded us of how little respect is still given to African sovereignty in many diplomatic corridors. And when I saw the response, how young people across Africa rallied, how the hashtags trended, how artists and influencers stood up, it made me believe for the first time in a long time that we are finally taking our narrative into our own hands. We've seen presidents overthrown, aid suspended, and resources looted, all while being told it's for our own good. But now Traoré didn't even need to raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone or launch a counterattack. He simply stood still and let the truth walk on its own legs. That silence was thunderous. It told us that our leaders no longer need approval from Washington, Paris, or Brussels to lead their people with pride. I remember reading Langley's comments and thinking, here we go again. But then came the wave, an unstoppable current of African unity. I saw murals in Bamako, protests in Ouagadougou, and fiery discussions online from Lagos to Johannesburg. I saw the new Africa, one that thinks, reacts, and resists with dignity and creativity. As someone who grew up hearing only the Western perspective about my continent, this moment felt like redemption. For once, it wasn't the international media shaping the story, it was us. African voices, African youth, African truth. The narrative changed because we changed it. Langley didn't shift his stance because of a meeting in the Pentagon. He shifted because the streets, the screens, and the spirit of Africa left him no other choice. It also made me realize how powerful a sentence can be. One line from a U.S. general sparked a continent-wide debate on sovereignty, respect, and ownership. But more than that, it awakened in many of us a sense of collective purpose. We began asking the right questions: who owns our gold? Who decides what's democratic? Why do our choices need foreign validation? Another thing I noticed is how even those who disagree with Traoré's methods found themselves standing behind him. That is rare in our politics, when opposition members temporarily lower their banners to defend national dignity. It was not about politics. It was about pride. And that, to me, is the beginning of real political maturity. To be honest, I wasn't always a supporter of military-led transitions. I still worry about the long-term impact on democracy. But this incident made me look deeper. Perhaps what we need now is not leaders shaped by foreign scholarships and NGO conferences, but by the urgency of our people's needs and the harsh lessons of our history. Leaders who speak less, but act more. Leaders who don't flinch under pressure from distant capitals. Langley's apology or praise, whatever you want to call it, didn't feel sincere. It felt forced. And in that, there's another lesson: respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. And if the U.S. wants to remain relevant in Africa, it has to listen, not dictate. The moment Langley changed his tone, I thought, too late. The damage had been done, but the awakening was irreversible. What he intended as a scolding ended up being a gift, because he helped unify a generation that had never fully agreed on anything before. He made us look in the mirror and realize we don't need anyone's permission to be proud of who we are and where we're going. I also felt proud to see how African scholars, journalists, and even street vendors began discussing serious topics: resource ownership, global power dynamics, and post-colonial identity. The conversation had shifted. We weren't just reacting emotionally. We were analyzing, organizing, and reframing the global discourse with intellectual rigor. To see a U.S. general forced to change his narrative because of African youth, that's historic. And I hope every student in every African classroom hears about this case one day, not as a footnote, but as a turning point. A moment when Africa stopped being lectured and started leading. Even the silence from other African governments was powerful. When no one comes to your defense, not even your allies, that's a diplomatic message. That's when you know you miscalculated. Langley may still wear stars on his shoulders, but the respect he once carried here is gone. Respect once lost is hard to regain. What struck me most was that Traoré didn't ask us to defend him. We chose to. That's what leadership looks like when your people rise to shield you, because they see their own future in yours. That kind of loyalty can't be manufactured. It can't be exported. It must be earned the hard way. I've always believed that history moves in cycles, and this, I think, is the start of a new African cycle, one where we don't just survive, we define, one where we no longer fear losing Western support because we've realized that unity and self-respect are our most powerful currencies. Langley's mistake, ironically, gave us clarity. It exposed the lingering colonial mindsets still embedded in many foreign policies. And it reminded us that dignity is not a Western gift, It's an African inheritance. As I finish writing this, I feel more hopeful than ever. Not because we've won some great battle, but because we've woken up. The world will now think twice before speaking for us, and if they don't, we'll speak louder. Not with anger, but with conviction. Not with violence, but with vision. This is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning, and this time Africa holds the pen.